I call this debate to order. Resolved, the media has become a conspiracy of left-wing ideology. And with that, we're going to invite our first speaker in the affirmative. This is going to be Allan Falk. And Allan, you'll have 4 minutes for the first speech, and we'll give you about a minute warning. And with that, Allan, please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome to this amazingly large group of people. I had a little trouble with the resolution itself because the word conspiracy implies some things to me that I'm not sure is really there. I experience a lot of bias in the mass media, and I think a lot of it really is toward the liberal, ultra-liberal, Democratic, whatever side. But the conspiracy implies to me that there's somebody who's leading it, who is saying, okay, let's get together and do this, and how to do it. And while there may be somebody or some organization doing that, I don't get the sense that there is. I think it's just a bunch of people who have similar beliefs, and they feed on each other. Their belief system drives them to say things and do things in certain ways, which to me are easily identifiable as, in this case, left-leaning. And it's mostly out of my experience of just having watched a whole bunch of different mass media and the left and the right. I do want to say that I am basically an independent. I've been accused of being everything from a Trumpite to an ultra-liberal, which is really kind of funny because I can find criticisms with both sides or each side or whatever, and I'm volunteered to do that. Recently, I've opened a challenge to anyone who labels me as one or the other, that if you think I'm a Trumpite, I'd be willing to offer at least 3 items that I think Trump really screwed up, or that the conservatives really get wrong. And in return, I'd like you to tell me at least 3 things that you think Biden or the Democrats have screwed up. And I've offered that probably a couple dozen times on various chat rooms and media groups and whatever. And to date, nobody has taken up the challenge. It's kind of interesting. Why not? Okay, well, I've had a lot of therapy in my life, about 13 years of that. And I've done some personal growth groups, which have got me really focused on words and communication and what people say and kind of the innuendo that might be underneath it. I subscribe to a Reason magazine, which is like center-right by most votes. I subscribe to The Economist, which I'm pretty clear is center-left at least. And the reason I say that is using The Economist as an example, and many of the mass media that we see today, they don't seem to be able to say or use the name Trump without adding an adjective in front of it or after it, like the failed candidate or some other descriptive, which is not needed really in terms of a debate or in terms of journalism. So it becomes non-journalism, it becomes commentary. And people talk about, hey, remember when Walter Cronkite used to do the news? I am that old. I've seen him. I watched him on TV. And he did something which I think has been done in some of the British newscasting in decades that passed that. He would read the news. He would never say, oh, that's terrible, or, hey, I'll take that guy out and shoot him. He would just say, this is the news. Go digest it. Think what you want to think. And in Britain, it's, I'm reading the news. Here's the news. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. But then I go to something like CNN, which actually is one of my wife's favorites. You can imagine some of the discussions we have at home. And if I watch, Anderson Cooper or any of these other guys over the last, say, decade or two, it's not they're reading the news, It's they're interpreting the event in a way to convince you that their evaluation of the event is pretty much the only way to look at it. So again, I don't think it's a conspiracy. I just think it's a whole bunch of people who are on the same bandwagon or on the same wavelength, or reading from the same playbook. And I really don't like that. I don't see it as a conspiracy. I just see it as a mass wave. I like critical thinking. So in part of my critical thinking is like, okay, if this is a conspiracy, where did it come from? How did it start? What provoked it? I can't find anything other than the accusation that maybe, George Soros is funding the whole thing, which I find plausible, but I can't prove it. And so I don't see conspiracy, but I just see a massive wave that adds descriptors which are unnecessary to anything they report, which slants you and tries to slant you in the direction of assuming that their evaluation of an event is the right way to look at it, and their view, which tends to be a liberal, democratic, left wing, whatever you want to call it, view, is the right view. And if you disagree with them, they'll either talk over you or interrupt you, as we've seen in a lot of alleged interviews. So let's see if I want to say anything else. Yeah, a lot of it has to do with word choice, body language, innuendo. So, I read that, like I said, and done a lot of therapy. So I'm really tuned into what people say, how they say it, body language, whatever. And okay, maybe I'm OCD, but I see a lot of that. And I think that's about all I want to say about it right now. So over to you, Chet.
Allan, thank you so much for sharing and for being the first one to go tonight. So thank you so much for your courage and sharing. So at this point, we're going to open it up to questions for our speaker, Allan. And I see some hands are raised here. So I'm going to just call on a few people. First, Brenda, I see your hand there. Please go ahead and ask your question, and just a reminder to address it to myself, the chair.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask the speaker what his opinion is of the PolitiFact fact checking that goes on about various announcements or media stories. What is his opinion of the fact checking that goes on these days?
Thank you.
Glad to answer that one. Back in the days when Snopes was pretty well regarded, I discovered that they were always defending the Democratic side or liberal side, and always accusing anything that resembled conservative or Republican. I think PolitiFact does the same thing. I've read what they've said. I've read their analyses, and I think they are biased. And they claim to not be biased, but maybe it's just me, but I can read into it a lot of actual bias. And to me, it's kind of transparent. It's sort of like Facebook or Twitter when somebody says, "Here's an unbiased evaluation." It's like, nah, it's not. So I put PolitiFact in that kind of category. Okay, I hope that helps.
Let's take another question. Scott, I saw your hand up pretty early, so please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, Mr. Speaker, and hello, Mr. Chair, and greetings to the speaker. I see that he's a fellow objectivist enthusiast, and I'm glad to see that. Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask him tonight if he believes that if the speaker believes that the head or the major news organizations that represent the right wing, such as Fox News, various talk radio places, News Nation, the major channels that are seen as right wing are equitable as far as quality and bias goes with the major, with the major more liberal media outlets that are recognized as such. So, you know, say like the New York Times, CNN, you know, places like that. If he thinks that the quality and the bias are equal on those, or if he thinks that maybe the quality and bias are less on one side and greater on another. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
that.
That's kind of a tough question, I think. And again, it's my point of view where I'm coming from. That I think on average, and again, for me, the conservative biases tend to be a little bit more objective, a little bit more fact reporting, with less of the innuendo and whatever, to say, you know, ours is the right way and the only way, other than when they get evangelical about it. Then I go to look at something like CNN, and it's always fun because when my wife turns on the TV, the default is to come up with CNN, and I can only watch that for a couple seconds because they are about as far gone as you can imagine. And when I look at, again, the innuendo and the subtext and everything, New York Times guaranteed to defend anything that's liberal and guaranteed to attack anything that's conservative. Washington Post, LA Times, you name it. They all use the same playbook. And I think I find them to be much more extreme in the way they apply that than my experience. Again, it's running through my filters, you know, whatever kind of colored glasses I'm wearing, than the conservatives. Now, some of the conservatives are, you know, to me are just, you know, whacked out far right lunatics. But the ones that try to stay on topic, I think I find them a little bit better, less biased, you know, whatever. I hope that helps.
Thank you. I think because the questions have been very direct and the responses as well, which I certainly appreciate, maybe we can have one more question. Michael, friend, I see your hand up there. Go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Could you ask the speaker where he thinks the best places to find minimally biased and maximally objective news are?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. I'm glad you asked it. And a lot of people ask me that. I say, okay, you know, what's the best place to go for something that's unbiased or unslanted or whatever? And my answer typically is there isn't any. In pretty much every news outlet that I've run into, or in social media groups and whatever, they have their biases. So for me, my best recommendation has been for the last, you know, since about 2020 election, is to look at a variety of different sources and make your own judgment. Just think for yourself as to whether or not they're slanting the news, or they have an agenda that comes across pretty clearly. And that's why I said I'm subscribed for the next 5 or 10 years to Reason magazine, and I also subscribe on a yearly basis to The Economist. And I weigh them against each other. I find The Economist is really wonderful for worldwide news and who's doing what to whom, and they're fairly objective about it. Although there's always an underlying, you know, Trump is bad, he lost the election, he's a fool, he's a jerk, whatever. They always add that innuendo. Reason magazine does pretty much the same thing. They're anti-socialist, they're anti-anything that isn't capitalist. And judging from this, you can tell I'm a free market capitalist. But my suggestion is go to a bunch of different sources of different views and just think for yourself. I don't think there's any outlet that I've ever seen that I would consider really a balanced source of the answers to the kind of question you're asking. Thanks for the question. That was really good.
Thank you so much for the wonderful questions. Allan, thank you again for your speech. So now we're going to flip it over and turn it over to our first speaker in the negative. And that speaker is going to be Phillip. So Phillip, you'll have 4 minutes, and whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Howdy, folks. Can you hear me all right? All right, sounds great. So I'm a farmer in central Illinois, and living in a rural area, one of the most common news sources is Fox News. Fox News is a conservative news source. I don't think that that's a controversial statement at all. But Fox News is only one of many news sources that you can find in the modern political environment. In fact, Fox News is not even the largest news source that you can find in the modern political environment. But it does happen to be the largest conservative news source. And as a result, a lot of conservatives tend to go on to Fox News as their primary source for their day-to-day news. There are other conservative news sources. I know that the Drudge Report is one of them. I think that the Wall Street Journal could be considered a conservative news source, but that's besides my point. There are a lot more. I think that it is a fair statement to say that there are more mainstream liberal news sources than there are mainstream conservative news sources. I believe that there are a couple of reasons for that, but the reason that I'd like to provide in that supports the idea of the opposition is the idea that the Overton window, or what is acceptable in conservative and liberal policy in the last couple of years, has shifted, or at the very least expanded. In 2014, Pew Research did a study on where people got their news sources, what kind of locations they tended to get their news, and what they trusted. It differentiated by conservative and liberal. I'm guessing that it differentiated based on what people self-identified as conservative and liberal, which might not be the best representation, but we can go back there. And it found that, of course, conservatives tend to view Fox News as the most credible source. But it also found that most conservatives view a wide variety of liberal sources as either highly uncredible or mostly uncredible. That wasn't quite the case when they looked at liberal pollees. A lot of people identified as left identified conservative news sources such as Fox and Drudge as being partially credible or mostly credible. I think that it's apparent in the last couple of elections and the last couple of electoral cycles that there has been a shift away from the median when it comes to political ideology. And Fox News, being the sort of beacon for conservative ideology, has stayed the beacon for conservative ideology. Whereas liberal news sources are being seen on a regular basis as untrustworthy by conservatives, as a source of fake news or of irresponsible news reporting. The same wasn't identified in this report with Fox News.
The 1 minute heads up, Phillip. 1 minute.
1 minute, okay. Essentially, the idea that I'm trying to get at is that sorry. The conservative news media and the liberal news media are not really centralized. There is one central source for conservatives that tends to be Fox News. There's a lot of sources for liberals. One of the major problems that gets identified is that liberal news sources are... Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. My apologies.
Yeah. Phillip, you're doing some. Feel free just to take a moment. You still have a little bit of time.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Essentially, the point that I'm trying to make overall is that the conservative news media, Fox News media, is seen Fox News is seen as the conservative news media. There's a lot more sources for liberal news media. Therefore, I can't see how a conspiracy could be identified between left-wing news sources. And I apologize for the struggle at the end.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Phillip, for sharing. So let's open it up to a few questions now for our speaker. Rick, I will hand it over to you, please.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask the speaker, it seemed like he was conflating mainstream and liberal. I mean, I I don't know that I heard him say the word mainstream news. He kept saying liberal news sources, and I'd like to understand why he would think any particular source is liberal in that regard. Any mainstream source was liberal by default almost.
Thank you for the question.
Certainly. I think I struggled a little bit with my words in general. I lost my train of thought throughout that event, so I'll apologize for that. In the last couple of years, the context given for news, for mainstream media, has been conflated with liberal news media. I don't think that the primary news source in the United States is a liberal news source. The source that I'm using right now for media bias is allsides.com. There are a lot on that website that tend to lean left. The point that I wanted to make was that there's one major news source for most conservative ideologies in the United States, while there's a pretty wide variety of liberal news sources. Whether or not that actually describes any kind of political factor is besides it.
Thank you. Harry, I see your hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Mr. President, my question really relates to broadcast media. Fox News is available for cable or satellite subscribers, but for those families that do not have, are not able, or choose not to access them, or are cord cutters, may not have access to Fox. Is there a broadcast? Does he view any of the what I would call broadcast, avoiding the term mainstream broadcast media, which would include the major networks and NPR or National Public Television, that would be conservative?
Great question. I think that, I mean, Fox News has a online news platform. Their Fox website, I believe, is the fourth most visited news source in the United States, based on a poll that I saw earlier today. So again, that's one conservative option. It's difficult to say what news sources are even effective when it comes to especially internet news, because a lot of the research that I saw showed that people don't actually tend to go to news websites. They tend to get their news off of an aggregator site or off of social media, which directs them onto an aggregator site. You could see a news source that comes from Fox News or CBS or CNN on Facebook, utilize that source, and then internalize it and use it to go about your day, and not actually click on that source and have it put into some kind of algorithm or research program that would show whether or not you saw it. I think that there'd have to be some more research into that. But the online news issue is a big challenge, and it's something that I don't know how we would particularly study as easily as cable news.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the answer. Let's take one more question. Diana, go ahead.
Can I unmute? Okay, I'm unmuted. Okay. I kind of want to drill down on the idea of conspiracy. To me, a conspiracy implies that people are working together, and it has also a vague implication that they might even be competent. And it looks to me like media, mainstream and otherwise, are all competing furiously for eyeballs and for eardrums. I don't see, I mean, I live in San Francisco, a liberal bastion. We're not organized, and I don't think we can conspire to do anything practically. So I'd like to focus on the term conspiracy, and also kind of make sure we agree on what is mainstream media.
And Diana, do you have a question within that for the speaker?
The question is, what are mainstream media, and what do we mean by conspiracy? Or do we agree on the definition of mainstream media?
Thank you.
For me, the definition of mainstream media would just be top 5, maybe top 10 news media sources. I think it's a challenge because as we've there wouldn't be a debate if there wasn't a difference between people's media interests. So there will be some people who would make that definition differently, but I think that just having the top grossing or perhaps the most viewed media sources be the definition would work. Onto your point briefly about the idea that there's no coordination between media sources. I agree. And I would argue that most, if not all, media sources are currently in competition with each other. The marketplace of ideas is a marketplace. There are different news stories that are going to get picked up by different news sources, and the ones that get to it first and the ones that make the biggest headlines tend to get the most clicks. That leads to ad revenue, that leads to an increase in profits. There are situations where the process leading to that can lead to some bias or can lead to some poor journalism. But I don't necessarily think that that's a conspiracy theory. I think that that's just the system of news media based on our system of capital.
Thank you so much, Philip. And Diana, thank you for the question. And it really does address an important point about this resolution, is that there is a pretty strong word in there, which is conspiracy. And because that word is in there, that might change the direction of whether we're in the affirmative or the negative, and makes our thinking in this debate topic a little bit more nuanced and more complex. So I appreciate you bringing in that complexity, and let's keep that going. Let's bring in a little bit. Let's keep bringing in that nuance and complexity as we go along. All right, great. So at this point, we just had a speech in the negative, so we're going to go back to the affirmative. But at this point, I also want to bring in Al, our co-chair for tonight, and pass it over to him to set up our next two speakers. And Al, I think you're still muted here.
My apologies. Okay, a speaker in the affirmative is Sherry. And Sherry, if you could keep your comments to about 3 minutes, because we had a lot of people on the Zoom, and I know we have a lot of questions, a lot of hands going up. So Sherry, it's yours.
Okay, so we all know the press is biased towards liberals and Democrats. It's been a long time in the making and started long before new technology. I'm almost 60. I've been watching media for a long time. In the 80s, every single political news show, including 60 Minutes, Meet the Press, always had 4 liberals and maybe 1 conservative. When I was in college in the early 80s, I was studying political science and reader of Orwell, and I could see the liberal bias was becoming more entrenched, and I'm going to use the word more collusionary. Then the data started pouring in. Pew Research conducted studies starting in 1995 through 2004, and I was shocked when I saw it the first time. Only 7% of journalists consider themselves conservative, and only over 90% of press donations went to Democrats. There was a book that Tim Grosclose wrote in 2010, which was peer-reviewed research measuring media bias, and it showed that all mainstream media outlets have a liberal bias, while some supposedly conservative outlets like the Washington Times or Fox News lean right. Their conservative bias is less than the liberal bias of mainstream outlets. That's from peer-reviewed research. So don't give me fallacies like, oh, Fox News. And I want to be careful about the all sides chart, which is shared throughout schools right now. It's not actually valid research because of how it's crowdsourced. But this all built to 2016, when instead of trying to hide bias, the news media kind of doubled down and started colluding with the Democrat Party. They bluntly stated their objective reporting was done, and they were activists. It's become even easier to perpetuate all this with the use of technology. Have you read the Twitter files showing how technocrats colluded to shut down absolutely true information about everything from the fake dossier to COVID to the Biden laptop? And they took direction from a variety of left-leaning organizations and the DNC. Have you read the Columbia Journalism Review, the most prestigious journalistic publication that concluded every major claim in the Russiagate collusion lie was false? But for 5 years, ABC, CBS, CNN, NYT, WAPO, and NBC used a fictitious piece paid for by Democrats and amplified absurd lies. I'm concerned because Joseph Goebbels said a lie told once is a lie, but a lie told 1,000 times becomes truth. What's scary is the New York Times and Washington Post won Pulitzer Prizes for the fake news coverage of their fake dossier. Yes, they awarded themselves prizes for lying to you. Our U.S. press is supposed to be investigative reporters in search of a truth to share with the American public so we can have critical thinkers and educated voters. My list is long about the whoppers the press colluded on. Maybe you think the Covington Catholic kids assaulted a Native American man. Not true. Did U.S. border agents whip illegal immigrants? Is the Trump family Russian agents? Joe Biden knew nothing about his son's influence peddling business, though they were on planes together to international media. Was the Hunter Biden laptop Russian disinformation? Trump called Nazis very fine people. Please read the second paragraph of the speech and don't just believe the press, the mainstream press. And how crazy, given Trump's favorite Karen kids are Jewish. Did you even know that? So how is it collusive? Nearly 100% of fact checker donations went to Democrats. How are they unbiased then? The liberal AP controls the verbiage with their style guide, all driven with liberal bias. Technocrats censor conservatives all the time for saying true things, but let other lies fly. The MSM
Sherry, about another 30 seconds, please.
Absolutely. The MSM, or the mainstream media, gets talking points from someone. There are montages that show the exact same words. It's kind of back to Orwell's telescreens. Honestly, I could talk for days and maybe my whole 60 years about the obvious signs the American public is being propagandized by the press. Just knowing that over 90% of the press is liberal is scary, but they've proven they're acting more as a mouthpiece of a political party. So I do a lot of things. I read many media sources, and you don't need peer-reviewed research to know that there's bias. We need to start being educated citizens and voters. And if you want more examples or books to read, just let me know.
Thank you, Sherry. I see numerous hands going up. Ruth, if you would pose your question for Sherry to me. Ruth, you're muted. Okay, we'll come back to Ruth. Marielle, if you would ask the question to me for Sherry.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, the question I have is, why would half of the country not be involved in the mainstream media and defend a more conservative point of view? That's the question.
Thanks for the question. You know, I think this evolved, like I said, over many years. And, you know, there was definitely a decision. And if you watch a little bit of political science, you'll understand how the left decided to kind of infiltrate certain parts of our, you know, educational system, et cetera. You know,
it's not really that good.
I also think that, you know, sometimes I think conservatives and liberals, and if you read some of the works by some noted psychologists like Jonathan Haidt, they care about different things in terms of conservatives tend to think about their smaller spheres of influence and really being focused on family, community, church, and liberals sometimes like to think bigger, broader goals. But, you know, obviously they were also, Fox News came out there, but, you know, again, like I said, it's not as conservative as the mainstream media is liberal. And that's just a fact. You know, you're right. I think if I had a lot of money, I'd get a lot more conservatives going to media. Maybe they know that they've had some problems over the last 20 years, the way they've been treated, though.
Thank you, Sherry. Let's go back to Ruth. Ruth, if you can unmute and ask the question to me for Sherry. Maybe not. Okay. Larry, let's go to you. And I'm sorry, Chuck, I'll come back to you.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask the presenter, I heard her say something about New York Times giving himself an award for lying to the public. I asked her if she has an opinion on the fact that Fox News is the only media that I've heard of that ever got sued for $800 and some million for lying to the public.
Well, thanks for the question. You know, lawsuits are interesting things and not all is correct. I think what I'm telling you is that we know that the Columbia Journalism Review said that all of the lies for 5 years about the collusion story with Trump were lies. And we know those were lies, but then the New York Times and Washington Post got Pulitzer Prizes for that. I personally don't want to be lied to by my press, and 5 years of it, that's a long time. So lawsuits aside, what I know is what happened and what they received for it. And I just thought that was strange. I think they should have given it back. Honestly, if they were honest brokers, they would have said, hey, this was not a true story. The collusion lie that was paid for was not true, and we got a prize for it. Yeah, I'd return it. That's what I do.
Thank you. Thank you, Sherry. Chuck, your question, if you unmute.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to compliment the speaker on her speech. I particularly was interested in your comment about the what the Pew Research was. I think you said it was back in the 90s when 7% were conservative and 93% were liberal in the reporters. And I live in Los Angeles, read the Los Angeles Times, and it seems to me that although they've been liberal, which was fine with me, for a long time, about the beginning of first quarter of 2020, they seem to take an even hard turn to the left, to the progressive. And about the same point in time, I ran into a lot of other places that seem to be doing the EDI training, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I wondered if there was some kind of a correlation going on between outfits, newspapers, corporations, non-governmental entities doing EDI and then taking hard shifts towards the left into what we would call woke, for lack of a better term. And I would ask this of you, but I'd also be interested in hearing it from anybody else here, is if they're a reporter, and does this dovetail with their experience? Did they go through some kind of training, and out of that training, they came out with this progressive bent? Thank you.
I could comment from two perspectives. I've been involved in corporate America, and I'm involved in the education field right now. And I think you're absolutely right, Mr. Speaker or Mr. Questioner. I think that forced training, and I've had quite a few friends who over the last decade have kind of left corporate America. I think it happened in journalism in school, and I also in the education field, because they were not allowed to have their point of view, and instead they had to conform. And again, that's kind of messed up in the press as well, kind of like we talked about the AP Style Guide, which dictates how you can refer, for example, to a factual legal term called illegal immigrants had to be then called undocumented aliens or undocumented, I can't remember now, undocumented. So these kind of things, like you say, this verbiage gets controlled. That's the conspiracy and collusion part. I don't like the word conspiracy either, but we need to be honest. You know, you look at yourself in the face and say, wow, if 90% of the press voted or donated to the other party, how would I feel? I might feel kind of bummed. So the 50% of Americans who are not liberal probably feeling pretty bummed. So.
Thank you, Sherry. Rick Hasty, your will be the last question, and I see a lot of other hands up. I apologize. We want to keep moving on and get more speakers in and more questions. Hopefully you come back and ask the question when the next speaker in the affirmative makes that statement. So Rick, if you unmute and ask Sherry.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask the speaker, first of all, to clarify things. There is no Democrat Party. It's the Democratic Party. Okay. Aside from that, I'm really interested in some of the sources that you said.
That the speaker used. Mm-hmm.
That the speaker used. You know, some of those are reputable names. Pew, Columbia School of Journalism, and so on. But in terms of, you know, most journalists being self-identified liberals, to me, all that means is those are the kind of people that go into that field. Just like the people who go into maybe the police force or the military tend to be overwhelmingly conservative. Different careers attract different types of people. To me, that's not necessarily evidence that what they're doing in their coverage of the news has some bias to it.
Well, so thank you for the question. I try to provide you actual facts. So you either can, and you should take a look, I think you could read the peer-reviewed research by Tim Grosskreutz called Left Turn, peer-reviewed research. That was done in 2010. So if If it was bad then, it's gotten worse now. I think most people would probably agree. I really tried to cite a lot of very reputable sources. So if you want to, I'd be glad to one-on-one with anybody. I've been studying this for a long time. I think the data is pretty decently clear on these issues, and I tried to not just give my summarization, but looking at real facts as well as my 40-year experience and kind of interest, 40, 60-year experience and interest in this issue, and how I feel like it's a very negative thing, both for polarization and probably a major cause of it, as well as for our country.
And do you think there is such a thing as the Democrat Party?
So there actually are no follow-ups for this one, unfortunately.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I call it the Democrat Party. I don't get censored.
We're just
Okay.
going to leave that there for now. Go ahead. Allan.
Thank you, everyone. And if everyone has a hand up, if you put it down, and if we'll put it back. There you go. Thank you. Now let's switch gears a little bit and take a statement in the negative to the resolution. The resolution again is the media has become a conspiracy of left-wing ideology. And somebody who's going to speak to that, opposed to that, is Claire. Claire?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I work at All Sides in media bias. So full transparency, I'm coming at it from the perspective of someone who works in media bias. And I would actually be in agreement if the statement read something like, legacy news media has been captured by left-wing ideology. So you'll notice I changed two words there. I changed conspiracy and the media. So as many have mentioned, I think a lot of the problem is not necessarily conspiracy, but a lot of people with the same ideas in one room. And that makes sense to me when you look at how journalism has changed over time. It was once a blue-collar job where people walked into their neighborhoods, and it was a very humble job. You didn't get paid much, and you talked to your neighbors. But now it's prestigious to get a job at the New York Times and to go to elite universities to get that job. And when you look at the way we've pushed people on the center and the right out of universities, it makes sense to me that mostly people on the left would be attracted to a career in journalism. And second, I want to talk about the media. A lot of people in this discussion have narrowed it down to mainstream media. And I completely agree that legacy media outlets like the New York Times, the Associated Press, CBS, NPR, I could go on, they have all shifted to the left in their word choice and in their story choice. But I think we've also seen outlets pop up in response to that. We've seen the Daily Wire, the Free Press, a rise in Substack and independent journalism like Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi, and even Joe Rogan. He has one of the biggest podcasts in the world, debatably nearly as much influence as the New York Times. So I think it would be a shame not to include those voices under the umbrella of the media. And I do think when you look at the All Sides media bias chart, we have a lot in the lean left column, but we have nearly as many in the right column. And I think, people on the right tend to get their news sources from different areas. It's not always legacy outlets. It's sometimes what people consider alternative news. But I think that's still part of the media. They're just finding their voices in different ways that aren't necessarily the legacy ways of the New York Times. So that's why I stand where I do.
Thank you, Claire. I must say I find All Sides a very interesting look every time it comes on my screen. So, okay, some questions of Claire, if you would pose a question to me. And let's have the first one, Ken. Ken, if you would unmute.
Hi, my name is Ken. I'm in Houston, Texas, or Greater Houston. I'm actually a journalist. I am the editor of a small weekly newspaper that covers a very specific community in the Houston area. And I went to journalism school about 40 to 30 years ago. I had a break in my college career. I was in the military, but in journalism school, I was taught the basics of journalism, which are about objectivity, which doesn't mean that you don't have an opinion as a person about whatever you're covering, but you are trained to weed those things out of your news coverage, and you try to present all sides of whatever issue that you might be writing about. Now, I recognize that over the last decade, maybe a little more than that, that some media outlets have shifted leftward in their coverage, and I'm actually not one of the people who do that. Pardon me.
Ken,
But-
do you have a question for Claire? So she can
Well, okay,
respond?
going back to what Claire just said about alternative media. She mentioned a particular podcast person who is very prominent. That person does not do journalism. That person is a opinion person who has a very large following and makes a lot of money at doing what he does. But he's not trained in journalism and he's not trying to do journalism. He's trying to present his ideas in a particular way. And you can't really lump what he does with what my newspaper does or other media outlets that are mainstream media, legacy media do. That's just what I would say. And I would ask for her response to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I hear what you're saying. I do think there is a difference between, what a podcaster does and what journalism is. I would still consider opinions a part of the media, even though I think of the media as something slightly separate from journalism. But even if you completely take podcasters who just does opinion out of it, I still think the point stands about new outlets such as the Free Press, the Daily Wire, independent journalists like Matt Taibbi. I still think all of those examples would apply to my point. So thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Pardon pardon for my butchering names, but am I going to say this right? Zimowit? If I said that right, Zimowit, that's first name?
I go by Zem, but I can't use Zem
Oh,
anymore.
Zem. Zem's fine.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question of the speaker, and actually several previous speakers, and it actually has just been touched upon. Wouldn't it be more productive to actually bifurcate this discussion and distinguish news and news gathering from editorializing? It seems that, when people speak, for instance, about Fox News, they think of someone like Carlson Tucker. When people speak about MSNBC, they think of Rachel Maddow. But personally, I do not see that as a problem at all. They're columnists. They present a certain opinion, right? Would the speaker contend that news gathering itself, the way news is sourced, the way the stories are chosen, does the speaker believe that there's a bias there?
Claire?
Yeah, I think the questioner makes a really good point. There's definitely a distinction between opinion and news. And I don't think there really is a problem with people just stating their opinion as long as it's labeled as an opinion. I do see bias in news gathering. There are a lot of ways that we look at that bias. One is sensationalism in the headlines, the word choice they use. They might describe people as anti-choice instead of pro-life, for example. As well as being balanced in quoting people. They might have a story about the debt ceiling and quote only Republicans, and they quote one Democrat at the very end of the article. Things like that, or burying certain details further down. So if it's a story about someone that's been in a shooting and they don't mention that the person that was shot had a gun in their vehicle till very far down in the article, then that might be an indication of lean left bias. And those are a lot of the various things we might see in a news article that might be indicators of bias.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. John Kingerly, if your question to Claire is, if you unmute, John. There you go.
Yes, I'd like to first of all thank the speaker for being associated with, I believe you said, All Sides and Advantage Media, both of which I find to be extremely good sources, and strongly recommend that everybody who isn't aware of them looks into them. My question for you is, would you define or label some sort, excuse me, could she speak to us about some of the organizations that are most neutral in their bias, but have strong and reputable news as part of them? Thank you.
Sure. So we do have several outlets in the center column, like Christian Science Monitor, Reuters, BBC, to name a few. But I think something important to note is that things that are in the center column don't necessarily mean unbiased or neutral. It can also mean they have a lot of sensationalism, but maybe aren't predictably on the left or right. So, I mean, what I would recommend is actually don't try and find a source that's unbiased, but try and find sources on the left and right that are biased, and read both and decide for yourself. Because I'm a believer that no one can be truly unbiased at the end of the day, and it's not a bad thing to be biased as long as you're transparent about where that bias is coming from. So I'm of the opinion, rather than trying to find something neutral, find something in the center, something in the left, something in the right, all of the above. And if you can and have the ability and the time to read those, then as long as they're being transparent, yeah, I think read it and then form an opinion for yourself from that.
Thank you, John. Truth, if you have a question of Claire, and I love your name because it applies so well in truth and media. So hopefully Claire is a good answer for you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I wonder if the previous speaker could speak to those neutral sources and I think I had heard something about the neutral sources. If she could further explain that. Yeah, meaning something about sensationalism or something. I don't remember what the word was. If she could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I was referring to outlets that we put in the center on All Sides Media Bias chart. So we have the right, center, lean left, and left. And outlets in the center aren't necessarily neutral outlets. Sometimes they are, but at other times they might be outlets that are sensational or do display bias, but that bias isn't always on the left or the right, predictably. So they might show bias equally towards the left or the right, or they might have these really dramatic headlines that don't necessarily lean either way, but aren't what we would call neutral and reputable.
Thank you, Claire. Michael, I'm going to skip over you because I know you're going to make a statement later in the opposed. So let me go to Gary.
Well, actually, Al, we need to unfortunately move on to the next speech at this point. Typically, we would do like two. Sorry. And then you should pass the gavel back to Matt when you're ready.
Okay, Matt, you want to take it from here?
Thank you, Co-Chair Al. So we're going to come back to the next speech. And as April said, we're going to switch back to the affirmative. So I want to invite our next speaker. And these next round of speeches will be for 3 minutes. And so again, we'll give you about 30-second or so warning when you're getting close. But for our next speaker in the affirmative, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Is it Croy? Croix.
Oh, yes.
Fantastic. Okay. Croy, you'll be our next speaker in the affirmative. So whenever you're ready, and you'll have 3 minutes. Take it away.
Okay, wait, let me get my timer set. Okay. So yeah, so my opinion isn't, I wasn't really sure which way to put this. So what I've heard about a lot of allegations of media bias, and it's kind of sorry, just a second, I'm trying to okay.
Take your time.
So I've been hearing a lot of things about media bias, and I've been, trying to figure out exactly which sources, rather than saying, oh, the media, like trying to track down individual sources. But what I've kind of leaned on this theory that there's a complete, that there's just a lot of bias all around. And I think part of the reason that the liberal side seems to be going off the rails right now is exactly because for many decades, Fox News and especially a lot of the conservative talk shows that people would listen to kind of made the conservative side and the Republican Party go off the rails. And so nowadays, you have the Republicans putting out someone like Trump that's just so detached from reality that the Democrats no longer have anyone to really keep them in check, and so they're now going off track. I kind of wish I could like cite more specific sources, because a lot of this memory is a little bit fuzzy of exactly where I heard things, but we've had the Republicans and the right-wing media has been saying, been downplaying climate change for a long time, and that was partially because of money and influence from Exxon. And now, like, I'm seeing in the more like on PBS and NPR and even the Associated Press, like I'm seeing things like saying abortion care, even though that's very well disputed. Whether I don't want to get into that specific issue, but yeah, I'm just saying I think in summary, the left is going off the rails specifically because the right wing went off the rails first. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And is it Croy, or how would you pronounce your name?
Croy, yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you for the speech. So we're going to open it up to questions now. April Lawson, who I think is going to...
Yeah, I'm going to just, yes, sorry. Our friend Ruth is having a technical problem. That means she can't unmute. So she sent her question to me. And she is wondering about the effect of social media and the internet on the formation of news and learning. She wonders what role information literacy could have in assisting with understanding bias in the news and different leanings. So what would the speaker say about that?
Yeah, social media is probably about the worst place to get news, because it's like you're getting it from a reputable source, in which case you might as well just go to the source directly, or you're getting rumors from people that just have no idea what they're saying. You have no idea whether they're actually telling the truth or if they've just passed on misinformation unwittingly. So yeah, I think probably, and I think, a lot of the echo chambers from Facebook's algorithm and stuff for trying to show you what you want to see is a very easy way to get people into ridiculous conspiracy theories and anger no matter what side they're on.
Thank you, Ruth, for the question. Let's just take one more here. I know we actually have a lot of people who want to give a speech, so let's take one more quick question for the speaker. Ronald.
You are muted. You are still muted.
Ronald, you're still muted.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello? You
Yeah.
can't hear me? Excellent. I believe the speaker mentioned that recently, or more in recent times or last couple of years, that the left media has, I think you said, gone off the rails. I'd be interested in hearing some specific examples of that. Give me specific stories or examples of what you say was the left media going off the rails.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing really has just been, it seems like I've seen a lot like relating to abortion, for instance. Even though there's quite a bit of scientific evidence pointing against it being a good thing. I mean, I'm not interested in debating that here, but it's just, I see a lot of times now the like articles will say, like I said, abortion care, which clearly is putting it as a positive thing, rather than just using a neutral term like just abortion or access. They're using words like care and rights that suggest that it should be something that's Yeah, sorry if I'm a little.
That's okay. That's okay. Thank you for the question. Great question. Thank you for the response. So let's actually go ahead now to our next speaker in the negative, and that is going to be John Diamont. John, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, you can hear me?
Yes.
Sure. Miss, can you hear?
John, your audio is a little choppy.
Yo, just clarification. Is it?
John, sorry to interrupt you. Your
Does that
audio,
cut off?
John, your audio is a little choppy, so I think for the moment, we'll just take the next speaker. But if you can see if you can fix your Wi-Fi. Oh, I see you now. Do you want to give it one more shot real fast? Okay. All right. We'll move on. Move on to the next person. Sorry about that, John. No, unfortunately, we don't have good audio. Let's go to let's see here. Robin L. Speech in the negative. You'll have 3 minutes whenever you're ready.
Hi. I would like to speak about the fact that most large media are controlled and owned by a small number of ultra-wealthy, straight, white, cisgendered males. I don't see how that can be argued against, whether the company is privately held or publicly held. We've seen from, for example, Fox Media, when all the emails came out after the Dominion lawsuit, that Rupert Murdoch was getting involved in the day-to-day editorial content of his media. I think these owners tend to be very conservative. It's in their financial interest to be conservative, to cut taxes, to promote free market ideology and cut programs that don't benefit them. So they promote conservative points of view. I don't think it matters so much how journalism practitioners view their own views. They're worried about getting a check and feeding their families. They're not going to go against the editorial pressure that comes from these owners. I also think that since most of these owners are white, cisgendered males, they're unlikely to adequately value points of view from people who are different from them. So you don't see a lot of people in the media who are people of color, differently gendered, different sexual orientations, etc. I just have to point out too, and I apologize for this if it's out of line, but I have yet to hear a full-throated rebuttal of the resolution. And I question Braver Angels choosing speakers who are quibbling about the wording of the resolution rather than vociferously defending point of view that the liberal media is an urban myth, and truly most media represents much more conservative points of view than anything that is likely to be from the Democrat Party.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you for the speech. And I think here we have a pretty passionate and full-throated, if I might say, refusal or rebuttal against the resolution for today. So thank you for sharing that. And now we have an opportunity for anyone who would like to ask a question in regards to what Robin just shared. So let me just flip over to the question screen. Let's see here. Sherry, I see your hand up, I will give you a chance to ask a question. And again, please direct it to the chair.
Sure, Chair. I'm kind of wondering why, what the speaker thinks that all white heterosexual men have the same political views, and is there some way she could support that? Because I don't know that that's true. It sounds I don't know that that's true. And also, if she's watched it, there's quite a bit of variety of media, at least on the channels and groups of people I listen to. I don't know if you know, like Glenn Lowry or anybody. So yeah. So I'm just curious if she has any facts about that perspective about that.
Thank you.
I don't have any data to cite. I apologize for that. I do feel that it is clearly in the self-interest, the financial self-interest of the people who own the media to promote the points of view that are going to maximize their revenue and minimize their taxes. So part of my hypothesis is that people are interested in making their own situation better and not caring as much about what it does for other people. I also think that never mind.
Thank you, Robin. And thank you for the question. Let's take another one. Let's see here. Just make sure we give people a chance. David, I don't think we've heard from you tonight, so feel free to unmute and ask your question to the speaker through the chair.
Hi, as a staunch and liberal, I just want to support her on that view. But Mr. Chair, I would ask you to ask her. She's saying that cisgender white men tend to be conservative and they only care about profits. But there are a lot of liberal outlets that are run by these cisgender white men. So I'd like you to ask her about that. And also, all sides media chart, the majority of the left-leaning outlets are greater than the number of right-leaning. So there's a lot more liberal stuff going on. So I don't want her, just ask her about that. Okay.
What she thinks about all that.
Yeah. Did I give you a question or just a rant?
That's fine. I would argue that the number of outlets on each side of the political spectrum is not as important as the amount of wealth concentrated. If you took a sum of the worth of all those outlets. I'm not saying at all that white cisgendered males can't have different opinions. I am saying that ultra wealthy white cisgendered males do not tend to have a whole spectrum of opinions. They tend to look after their self-interest just like I would or anybody else would. I can't remember the other part. Do you want to refresh my memory? Oops, you're muted.
Although in your presentation, you were kind of hinting that, the media is full of these greedy white guys who only care about themselves. But if you look at the all sides chart, there are more liberals.
Just make sure to use third person she and versus you.
Okay. That was it basically.
Thanks. So.
Oops, you're muted.
Speaker, if you wanted to respond really quickly to that, feel free. If not, we can move on to the next question.
I would just say I do think that the media ownership has a fair amount of greedy white guys.
Thank you, Speaker. And let's take one more question, or maybe not. Maybe there are no more hands. Okay. No, there are some hands. Okay, I'd like to take one more question, if that's okay. Ron, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, thank you for taking my question. I'd like to ask the last speaker, Mr. Chairman, about the Washington Post, for example, who's owned by Jeff Bezos, and get her take on Jeff Bezos's interaction with that newspaper, where he's claimed he's been independent, and that newspaper has covered him in many derogatory ways. He's the owner of it. I wonder if she could respond to that.
Thank you.
I have to admit, I don't know a whole lot about the Washington Post in particular. I have heard that he is relatively hands-off, and that may be the exception that proves the rule. It may also manifest itself in much more subtle ways. But I can't really speak to the Washington Post in particular.
Robin, thank you so much for the passionate speech, and thank you for everyone who also asked a very passionate and pointed question as well. Let's come back into the affirmative here. How about Leslie Bailey, if you'd like to make a speech, and we'll have these be, correct me if I'm wrong, I think 2 or 3 minutes. So somewhere around there, whenever you're ready, Leslie.
Okay. I would like to speak. Okay, I'm saying I agree with the assertion, but I do not believe there's a conspiracy. Okay, I think what Natalie said about most journalists being liberals, having liberal backgrounds, makes a lot of sense to me. Because when I think of the mainstream media, and that's what I'm mostly concerned with here, are major news sources. Okay, my major news sources are PBS and NPR, have been for years. I also read the papers. Actually, now I listen to and read a lot of different stuff. But it's because, even though I'm a liberal, I started really feeling disturbed by what I felt was an uncritical acceptance of certain liberal viewpoints on NPR and PBS that I think come from a desire to be compassionate, to be nice, definitely not to be or to be racist. My God, heaven help us if we would risk being thought racist. And it's very easy to be thought of as racist nowadays. But what the woman from All Sides was talking about the selection of stories, the selection of people interviewed on these channels, the language used, like routinely on NPR and PBS, people talk about human-caused climate change as being the reason for so many weather events. Okay, human-caused climate change. Not that anybody would argue that humans don't contribute to climate change.
Just one more minute, Leslie.
Okay.
Thanks.
They routinely talk about systemic racism in this country without entertaining any voices that make reasonable arguments against that claim. They routinely use language around transgender healthcare in a way that implies that if young kids aren't able to have surgery without their parents' approval, they're not getting basic healthcare. And they don't entertain reasonable voices against these things. I just see them as a bunch of nice people who want to show that they're compassionate and don't want to ruffle anybody's feathers. And I yearn, like the first speaker, for the days when news people they read the news, they gave the news. You couldn't tell what they felt about what they were reporting when they gave the news. Nowadays, heaven knows on the right, you know what they feel for the most part. But I think too often on the left, it's not as strong and obnoxious, but it is there. And it disturbs me. I feel like most people who listen to PBS and NPR just think they're getting the straight truth from reasonable people.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your speech. Let's open it up to questions for our speaker now, who just spoke in the affirmative for our resolution. I see some hands here. Eric, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
For the speaker, Mr. Chair, for the speaker, I wanted to ask them, what does the meaning anti-racist mean to them, and would they consider that a civil duty?
Good question.
Am I unmuted? Yeah. Okay. I mean, I've really studied this stuff. The term anti-racist was coined by Ibram X. Kendi. It means very specifically that, you know, all of us white people, we are racist, whether we acknowledge it or not. The only way that we can be anti-racist, which is what he argues we need to be, is by promoting and supporting policies that will make things like wealth, income, number of board memberships, academic achievement equal across the races. Okay, I absolutely don't believe that. I don't believe that that should or could be legislated. That's what I mean. And I do not consider anti-racism. I'm anti-racism. I mean, the way it used to be used. I'm not anti-racist in the Ibram X. Kendi use of the term. But I think most liberals don't even know what that means. They've never heard of Ibram X. Kendi. That's my, and we don't distance ourselves enough from his viewpoints.
Thank you. I see some jazz hands from Eric. So thank you for the question and thank you for the response. Alice, who's in Northern California, feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chair. And to our current speaker, Leslie. I'd like to ask of Leslie, let's see. I was fascinated by your perspective, Leslie, as someone who's on the far left myself. And I don't recall how you identified, but
just a reminder, just to address it in third person. So her perspective or how she identified. Thanks.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you. So I'm wondering if she herself or amongst people she knows or she thinks this might be happening, that that bias in the media on the left is sometimes so extreme that it alienates people on the left even from listening to left media in search and going in search of more conservative media just in order to feel like we've gotten all the facts on the story or all the arguments. Thank you.
Well, that's certainly what I've done. I don't listen to MSNBC, just like I don't listen to Fox. I mean, I'm not interested in hearing people who are in the really smart, articulate people who are in the business of getting viewers and riling you up and really playing into your confirmation bias. That doesn't interest me. I just want the news. I want to hear the straight facts about what's going on. And I do want to hear opinions, but I want to hear a variety of opinions. And I was hearing so little of that, or some of the opinions that I heard specifically on the stations that I mentioned were so uncritically taken, when I just felt like, wait a minute, why isn't he asking, or why isn't she asking this person this question? She's just letting it go like it's accepted. You know, it's what all decent people think. And I just don't agree with that. Anyway, I'm a liberal. I'm not far left. I'm very moderate. And maybe these days I might even be slightly on the right. Good God.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you for these wonderful questions. We only have about 8 minutes left before we move into the last phase of the debrief. So I want to give a chance now for someone to respond again in the negative and perhaps a question or two after that. John, we had tried earlier, but your audio wasn't working. Maybe we can try again really quickly, and then I apologize if it doesn't work. We'll just move on really fast. But John Diamont, do you want to try unmuting and perhaps turn off your video? That might help. We may have lost John. Okay. next time. Let's see here. Tim Redman, feel free if you're still with us to unmute, and let's keep it please to about 2 minutes.
Oh boy. Okay, I'll try. Good evening, everyone. So I'm arguing that the media does not exhibit a liberal bias. Try to make 4 real quick arguments. One was already made, that people often conflate opinion with news. Tucker Carlson, Rachel Maddow, earlier it was mentioned, Anderson Cooper, they are not journalists. They're commentators. And a lot of times I see commentary on the right where people are saying, oh, the New York Times is so biased or the Washington Post is so biased, and they're actually referring to an editorial. And that's actually happening more on the left too. You have people on the left complaining, that Tom Cotton, for example, is allowed to have an opinion in the New York Times, but those are editorials. They're supposed to be opinionated. And that's very different from the main news page. Also, there's adversarial and structural biases. These were also mentioned. It's a business. If anything, CNN was a boon for Trump. They would show his entire rallies, where other candidates just receive 8-10-second sound bites. They would show an hour of him speaking. And many liberals were upset at this supposed, well, I think too, that's, CNN, that's not I wouldn't consider that, I'm talking about like nightly news in our major newspapers. And adversarial bias, they just like to attack politicians. And so if a Republican is in a sex scandal, it's going to get reported. If a Democrat is in a sex scandal, it's going to get reported. But the big thing is, the bias isn't so much with the media, it's with us. It's within us, and the expectations that we bring to it. And I'll share a couple studies really quick.
Well, 30 seconds, Tim.
Oh my gosh. Dave D'Alessio looked at this stuff from 1948 to 2012. No bias in the mainstream media. The Gross Close study that was cited earlier has all kinds of methodological problems. It is not a good study, even though it was a peer-reviewed. You could look at Brendan Nyhan. He completely deconstructs that. I could get into it, but I won't have the time. But if someone asks a question about it. And so there's also something called the hostile media effect. Great studies on this. They took over 1,000 subjects and gave them over 10,000 newspaper articles from Fox News, New York Times, Washington Post, ABC, NBC, CBS. You strip away the headline and you just give people the article to read. Democrats and Republicans cannot tell what the source is. And that's how I would encourage people to approach this. Have a friend take articles, from the main pages, from different sources, take off the headline, give it to you. And people cannot tell if it's, even if it's a main Fox News versus CBS, ABC, NBC. Sorry, 2 minutes is tough.
That's okay. 2 minutes is really tough. So thank you, and nice job keeping it concise. I want to give you a chance to respond to a question as well. Let's see here. We might have time for 1, maybe 2 questions. John, I see your hand up. John Scheinman, please ask your question to the speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to direct a question. The previous speaker was on the right track, and I think it should be pointed out, and perhaps he could confirm this or not, the use of evaluation systems for the news, such as Ed Fonte's media, and I've spent quite a while today looking through them, and Media Bias Fact Check. They impartially evaluate news sources, rate them by not only their reliability, but their bias. And this is done blindly, just as he suggested. And in fact, it's a good way to choose what one is reading and listening to, rather than a hunch. And so that's how I would suggest that people decide on their bias. But there is no conspiracy. The media wants to make money. And so it attracts the people that like what they're doing. But instead, you can choose for yourself and should use those sources. And I think All Sides is a similar operation, but media.
I want to make sure that you have a question directed.
The question is, don't you think that this is a good way to go to choose your source rather than to choose the whole media system for being biased in one way or the other.
Thank you so much.
Sure. I would, if I understand the question correctly, I mean, I think it's important to have a, a balanced news diet, as other people said before, understand what is opinion and what is, more straight reporting. But I would say that I believe all sides is just, that's folks kind of sort of self-reporting what they think. And so as I believe the questioner was saying, I mean, the best way to go, you need to look at the studies that strip off, that look at all of this. For example, the gross close study, it would look at certain sources for 2 months and other sources for like 10 years. That's not a fair analysis. They looked at what sources were mentioned like by think tanks, and if there were more liberal think tanks mentioned in an article than a conservative, they said, well, that was liberal bias, even if there was like 3 conservative sources and 3 liberal sources cited. That's what you have to look at. And you can, when you do this, when you strip out the headline and you actually go line by line and you count how many liberal sources did they cite, how many conservative sources did they cite, how many lines if they quote a liberal and conservative. I mean, it's incredible that a lot of times when you do this, it's exact. If the Democrat gets 13 lines, the Republicans get 13 lines. That means somebody is there counting. There are good journalists doing good work where they're literally counting the number of lines that each side will get in an article. And so I think and it's so hard for us because we bring our biases to it. And in these studies, they show liberals and conservatives the same thing in the same article, and liberals will say it's biased against liberals and conservatives will say it's biased against conservatives. It's not perfect. I'm not making that argument that it's perfect, but it's a lot better than I think people think.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, everyone. So now we're sort of getting to the end of our time together. I just want to thank you again, first of all, for being here and just being present here, even if you didn't speak or didn't have a chance to speak. And for all those who did speak and ask questions, thank you so much for doing so in a way that's both speaking your mind, but also being very respectful of the speakers as well. And that's really the spirit that we try to create here with Braver Angels. So thank you for participating in that.